The encounter. The late afternoon sun bathed Woodridge Heights in hues of amber and gold, casting long, gentle shadows along the cobblestone streets. Judge Nathaniel Carter sighed in contentment as he guided his sleek, newly purchased Audi through the peaceful neighborhood. It was a rare moment of solitude after another grueling day in court. Jazz music flowed softly from the speakers, harmonizing with the rhythmic hum of the engine, offering him a reprieve from the weight of his responsibilities. Nathaniel had spent his life pursuing justice. Born in the heart of a struggling urban community, he was no stranger to adversity. He had faced it head-on, using every challenge as a stepping stone to rise above the systemic barriers placed before him. Becoming a judge was not just his dream. It was a symbol of hope for those like him, proof that perseverance could transcend prejudice. As he rounded a familiar corner, the tranquility was abruptly shattered. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated his rearview mirror, their sharp glare contrasting against the golden evening. The shrill wail of a siren cut through the melody of his jazz station, leaving Nathaniel puzzled. His heart sank. He knew he hadn't violated any traffic laws. Everything about his car was in order. Yet the urgency of the lights compelled him to pull over. Calmly, he brought the vehicle to a stop at the curb. From the patrol car behind him, a tall, stern-faced officer emerged, her uniform pristine and her gaze unyielding. The nameplate on her chest read Officer Emily Harper. With an authoritative stride, she approached his window. Nathaniel rolled down the window, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit ingrained in him from years of navigating similar encounters. "License and registration," she demanded curtly, her tone sharp and devoid of pleasantries. Nathaniel raised his eyebrows at her brusqueness but complied without hesitation. Handing over the documents, he spoke evenly. "Good evening, officer. My name is Judge Nathaniel Carter. I live in this neighborhood. May I ask why I've been stopped?" Harper's eyes flicked to the documents without acknowledgement of his introduction. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she stepped back slightly. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Carter," she commanded, her hand hovering near the holster on her hip. Nathaniel frowned. "Officer, is there a specific issue? If you could clarify, I'd be happy to cooperate." His tone remained measured, but there was no mistaking the tension building in his chest. "Step out of the vehicle now," Harper repeated, her voice rising in authority. Nathaniel hesitated. He understood the delicate nature of the moment. A wrong move could escalate the situation. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he stepped out, the faint whispers of neighbors watching from their windows reached his ears. He stood tall, his suit immaculate, his composure resolute. The flickering lights of the police car cast alternating red and blue shadows on his face, but his expression remained steady. Inside, however, frustration brewed. "Is there a problem with my license or registration?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Harper's expression betrayed nothing but suspicion. "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen car from last week," she stated bluntly. Nathaniel blinked. "That's impossible," he replied. "This is my car. I purchased it recently, and all the paperwork is legitimate. You're welcome to verify that in your system." But Harper didn't seem inclined to verify anything. Instead, she exchanged a look with her partner, Officer Brian Mitchell, who had just arrived on the scene. Mitchell's rigid posture and stoic demeanor mirrored Harper's, though a flicker of unease crossed his face as he took in the scene. "Search the car," Harper instructed Mitchell, ignoring Nathaniel's protests. Nathaniel clenched his fists at his sides, anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "Officer Harper, I've done nothing wrong. My papers are in order, and there's no probable cause for this search. I'd advise you to reconsider." But his words fell on deaf ears. Mitchell moved toward the car, and Nathaniel watched helplessly as the officer began rifling through his belongings. The once tranquil evening had turned into a public spectacle. Nathaniel's neighbors, People he had greeted on morning jogs or waved to on weekends now peered from behind curtains and held up phones, capturing the unfolding scene. It didn't take long for Mitchell to emerge from the trunk holding a small black bag. He held it aloft, his expression darkening. "What's this?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen the bag before. "I don't know," he said firmly. "That's not mine." Harper's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk. "Not yours," she echoed mockingly. "Convenient, don't you think?" Nathaniel took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Officer, I am telling you that bag does not belong to me. I suggest you confirm the vehicle registration and run my identification. This will all be cleared up." But Harper wasn't listening. "Cuff him," she ordered Mitchell. The command hung in the air like a slap. Nathaniel's chest tightened as the cold realization of the situation sank in. He was being treated not as a respected judge, not even as a law-abiding citizen, but as a suspect, a black man whose presence and success seemed to challenge someone else's perception of who belonged. Mitchell hesitated, glancing at Nathaniel and then back at Harper. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Harper's gaze hardened. "Do it," she snapped. The metallic click of handcuffs closing around Nathaniel's wrists reverberated in the silence. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of being powerless in a system he had sworn to uphold. This wasn't just an insult to his position. It was an attack on his very identity. As Harper turned to Mitchell, issuing further instructions, Nathaniel spoke, his voice firm and clear despite the tightness in his throat. "You're making a grave mistake, Officer Harper. Not just for me, but for yourself. Justice doesn't take kindly to those who abuse their authority." For a brief moment, Harper faltered, the weight of his words breaking through her hardened exterior. Around them, the crowd of onlookers grew, their murmurs growing louder, their phone cameras recording every detail. This was no longer just about a misunderstanding over a car. It was about accountability. It was about exposing the prejudice that could so easily overshadow justice, revealing the truth. The murmurs of the growing crowd swelled into a quiet storm. Nathaniel Carter stood still, his hands shackled in cold steel, his breath measured despite the humiliation radiating through him. His sharp mind, honed through years of legal battles, was already calculating the next steps. This wasn't just a momentary injustice, it was a watershed moment for the people watching. He would ensure that it wasn't forgotten. Officer Mitchell fidgeted, his discomfort growing with each passing second. He stepped toward Harper, his voice low but insistent. "Emily, maybe we should check his identity and the car registration. This could get out of hand." Harper shot him a glare, her determination tinged with a flicker of doubt. The weight of the neighbor's eyes and the glow of recording phones were unmistakable, and even her ironclad resolve seemed to falter under their judgment. But her pride wouldn't let her relent. "Not yet. I'm following protocol," Harper snapped, though her voice wavered slightly. "If there's nothing to hide, it'll all come out in the wash." Nathaniel cleared his throat, his calm, resonant voice cutting through the tension. "Officer Harper, let me remind you that there's more at stake here than you realize. You're not just detaining a judge. You're revealing your own biases to the world. Every second you spend ignoring the truth is another second of injustice." His words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Harper seemed to hesitate. She glanced at Mitchell, who had already moved to his patrol car to access the database. A few agonizing moments passed before Mitchell's voice broke the silence. "The car's registered to Nathaniel Carter," he called out, his tone tinged with relief. "And his ID checks out. He's a judge." Harper's face paled. For a moment, she stood frozen, her rigid posture betraying the storm of emotions inside her. Embarrassment, confusion, and fear collided in her mind, each vying for dominance. She opened her mouth to speak but found no words. Nathaniel took a step forward, his cuffs jangling softly. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice steady but piercing. "Now the question is, will you acknowledge it, or will you double down and bury yourself further?" The crowd, emboldened by the turn of events, began to murmur more loudly. A woman in the front, holding her phone aloft, shouted, "He told you who he was. You didn't even listen." Another voice chimed in, "This is racial profiling, plain and simple." Harper's hands shook as she fumbled for the keys to the cuffs. With unsteady fingers, she unlocked them, the clinking sound as they fell away echoing in the tense atmosphere. Nathaniel rubbed his wrists, his gaze never leaving hers. I was just doing my job," Harper stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to let your biases dictate your actions. I've spent my life upholding the law, Officer Harper, and I've seen what unchecked prejudice can do to people. It destroys lives, ruins communities, and erodes trust in the very institutions meant to uphold justice." Mitchell stepped forward, his voice apologetic. "Judge Carter, I'm sorry for what happened tonight. This wasn't right." Nathaniel turned to him, his gaze softening slightly. "Acknowledging a mistake is the first step toward fixing it. Thank you for doing the right thing, even if it came late." Harper, however, seemed unable to meet his eyes. Her rigid facade had crumbled, replaced by a quiet shame. The onlooker's condemnation bore down on her, and she finally spoke, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Nathaniel sighed, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. "The problem isn't just this one moment. It's the mindset that allowed it to happen in the first place. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong. That's not just a mistake. It's a failure of judgment, one that could have cost me everything." The crowd, now emboldened, began to call for accountability. "File a complaint." One man shouted, "She should be suspended." Another added. Nathaniel held up a hand, and the crowd quieted. "There will be accountability," he said firmly. "But we're not here to destroy lives. We're here to rebuild trust, to demand better. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." A ripple of change. In the days that followed, the video of the encounter spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a stark example of systemic prejudice. Community leaders called for reforms, and protests erupted across the city, demanding better training for officers and greater accountability within law enforcement. Officer Harper was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. For the first time in years, she was forced to confront her own biases. She attended mandatory sensitivity training and began volunteering at community outreach programs, determined to understand the people she had wronged. Meanwhile, Nathaniel used the incident as a catalyst for change. He organized town hall meetings where residents could share their experiences and voice their concerns about policing. His courtroom became a space not just for justice, but for dialogue, where he advocated for restorative practices that addressed the root causes of prejudice. One evening, several months after the incident, Harper approached Nathaniel at one of these meetings. She stood at the edge of the room, clutching the small envelope. When the meeting ended, she stepped forward, her expression a mixture of apprehension and resolve. "Judge Carter," she began, her voice quieter than he remembered. "I wanted to apologize again. Not just for what I did to you, but for the harm I've caused others by not seeing them for who they truly are." Nathaniel regarded her for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging the harm is a start. The real work is what comes next." Harper handed him the envelope. "I wrote a letter, explaining everything. It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." Nathaniel took the envelope, his expression softening. "Thank you, Officer Harper. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. I hope you'll continue to use that courage to make a difference." As Harper walked away, Nathaniel felt a sense of closure. The road to justice was long, but every step forward, no matter how small, mattered. He glanced at the crowd gathered around him. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds. and felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just his fight, it was everyone's. And together, they would demand a better future. A new legacy. The aftermath of the incident didn't just ripple through the quiet streets of Woodridge Heights, it surged through the entire city. The footage of Judge Nathaniel Carter's unjust detainment, his dignified resistance, and his poignant words at the scene became a rallying cry for reform. Yet, for Nathaniel, the work had only just begun. One bright Saturday morning, Nathaniel sat in his study, the faint smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. He stared at the stack of letters on his desk, messages from people across the country. Some shared their own painful experiences with racial bias. Others expressed admiration for his resilience. Among them, a simple handwritten note caught his eye. "Dear Judge Carter, I saw what happened to you on the news. I'm just a teenager, but your courage inspired me. My brother went through something similar, but he didn't have anyone to stand up for him. I want to be like you when I grow up. Thank you for giving me hope. Darius." Nathaniel read the note twice, his chest tightening. Darius's words reminded him why he couldn't let this moment fade into just another headline. He decided to use his platform to address not only the systemic issues within law enforcement, but also the broader cultural prejudices that perpetuated inequality. The Summit for Justice. Within weeks, Nathaniel announced the creation of the Justice and Equity Summit, a citywide initiative designed to bridge the divide between communities and the institutions meant to serve them. Held in the city's largest civic center, the summit drew a diverse audience: activists, law enforcement officials, educators, and everyday citizens eager to make a difference. Nathaniel stood at the podium on the opening day, his commanding presence drawing silence from the bustling crowd. His voice carried the same calm authority that had captivated onlookers during his wrongful detainment. "We're not here to point fingers," he began, his gaze sweeping over the room. "We're here to point the way forward. This is not a time for division. It's a time for understanding, accountability, and change. We must ask ourselves, what kind of legacy do we want to leave behind?" His words set the tone for a series of discussions and workshops. Panels of legal experts, community leaders, and even reformed officers like Brian Mitchell shared their perspectives. Nathaniel personally led a workshop titled Justice with Empathy, where he emphasized the importance of viewing individuals as human beings rather than stereotypes. One of the most striking moments came when Officer Emily Harper, after months of reflection and training, volunteered to share her story. Standing before a room filled with skeptical faces, she began hesitantly. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But I've realized that admitting fault isn't enough. I need to earn back the trust I lost, not just from Judge Carter, but from the community I swore to protect." Her vulnerability struck a chord. By the end of her speech, the room broke into cautious but genuine applause. Harper approached Nathaniel afterward, her expression one of quiet gratitude. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make amends," she said softly. Nathaniel nodded. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Officer Harper, but every step you take matters." A beacon for the future. As the months passed, the summit's impact began to manifest in tangible ways. The city's police department adopted new community engagement policies and implemented implicit bias training for all officers. A civilian oversight board, proposed by Nathaniel, was established to ensure accountability within law enforcement. Nathaniel also launched a mentorship program for young people like Darius, who had written him the heartfelt letter. The program, named Bridging the Gap, paired teens from underserved communities with professionals in law, education, and public service. Nathaniel personally mentored Darius, who dreamed of becoming a lawyer. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Nathaniel met Darius at the local courthouse. The boy's eyes widened as they stepped into the grand, marble-floored building. "Someday," Nathaniel said, resting a hand on Darius's shoulder, "you'll stand here, not as a visitor, but as someone fighting for justice." Darius beamed, his youthful enthusiasm a reminder of the hope that Nathaniel had once clung to during his own struggles. Confronting the past. Despite the progress, Nathaniel knew that systemic change required confronting uncomfortable truths. One day, he received a call from the city's police chief, inviting him to speak directly to the department's officers. It was an unprecedented request, and one Nathaniel approached with a mix of trepidation and determination. Standing before a room full of uniformed officers, Nathaniel began with a story, not about the night of his wrongful detainment, but about his childhood. He spoke of the fear he felt when he saw police officers in his neighborhood, not because he was guilty of anything, but because he knew he'd be judged before he even spoke. "I'm not here to accuse," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to challenge you to see the humanity in every person you encounter. The badge you wear is a symbol of trust, not power. Don't let prejudice tarnish it." The room was silent as he finished. Some officers nodded in agreement. Others remained stoic, their expressions unreadable. But Nathaniel knew that even planting a seed of doubt in one person's mind could lead to growth. Full circle. A year after the incident, Nathaniel found himself back on the cobblestone streets of Woodridge Heights. This time, it wasn't flashing police lights that greeted him, but the warm glow of lanterns from a community gathering. The residents had organized a block party to celebrate the progress made since that fateful night. Nathaniel was the guest of honor, though he insisted that the credit belonged to everyone who had stepped up to demand change. As he walked through the crowd, he spotted Harper standing quietly near the edge of the festivities. She looked different, less rigid, more approachable. When their eyes met, she offered a small, tentative smile. Nathaniel approached her, extending his hand. "Good to see you here, Officer Harper." "Emily," she corrected with a touch of humility. "I'm off duty tonight." Nathaniel smiled. "Emily, then." They talked briefly, and Harper shared how the experience had changed her. "I won't pretend I'm perfect," she said, "but I'm trying. Every day." "That's all anyone can ask," Nathaniel replied. "Keep trying." As the evening wound down, Nathaniel stood on a small stage to address the crowd. His voice carried over the laughter and chatter, silencing the noise. "This community," he said, gesturing to the people around him, "has shown that change is possible when we come together. Tonight, we're not celebrating a single person's story. We're celebrating our collective power to make things better. Let this be a reminder that no matter how deep the divides may seem, we can bridge them with empathy, accountability, and determination." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a testament to the resilience of hope. As Nathaniel stepped down, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The scars of that night remained, but they had healed into something stronger, a new legacy for himself, his community, and, he hoped, the world. A movement beyond the streets. The momentum sparked by Judge Nathaniel Carter's story continued to ripple far beyond the streets of Woodridge Heights. The event had struck a nerve, not just in the city but across the nation. News outlets carried the story for weeks, not only highlighting the injustice he endured, but also praising his grace, composure, and commitment to systemic change. What began as a local incident grew into a national conversation, and Nathaniel found himself at the center of it. Despite the accolades and attention, Nathaniel remained focused on the work. He knew the fight wasn't about him. It was about the countless others whose stories would never reach the public eye. It was about addressing the structural inequalities that allowed bias to thrive unchecked. One day, as Nathaniel prepared to step into his courtroom, he received a phone call that would shift the trajectory of his mission. An unexpected invitation. "Judge Carter, this is Senator Evelyn Monroe," the voice on the other end of the line began. "I've been following your story and the incredible work you've been doing in your community. We need voices like yours on a national platform." Nathaniel listened intently as Monroe explained her vision. A federal initiative to tackle systemic bias in law enforcement and the judiciary. She wanted Nathaniel to join a task force aimed at reforming policies and creating a nationwide framework for accountability and equity. "I'm honored, Senator," Nathaniel replied after a thoughtful pause. "But my priority has always been my community. I wouldn't want to lose sight of that." Monroe's tone softened. "Your community is where this all began, but your story has inspired people across the country. Imagine the impact you could have if we worked together to bring these changes to a national scale." The conversation left Nathaniel contemplative. The idea of broadening his reach was compelling, but he wrestled with the responsibility of leaving his courtroom and the people he served daily. After much reflection, he decided he could do both. The Task Force for Equity. Joining the task force was unlike anything Nathaniel had experienced before. The room was filled with influential figures, senators, activists, academics, and representatives from law enforcement. Each came with their own perspectives, and not all were supportive of sweeping changes. Nathaniel quickly became a cornerstone of the group, his calm yet authoritative voice cutting through heated debates. He shared data, legal precedents, and most importantly, stories. Real-life accounts of people whose lives had been upended by bias in the system. During one particularly tense meeting, a law enforcement representative challenged Nathaniel's push for stricter accountability measures. "We're not all bad cops," the officer argued, his voice defensive. "Why should the good ones pay for the mistakes of a few?" Nathaniel leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Accountability isn't about punishing the innocent," he said. "It's about ensuring that those who misuse their authority don't tarnish the reputation of those who uphold it with honor. Transparency protects the good officers just as much as it protects the public." The room fell silent, his words resonating even with those who had been resistant to change. Over the next year, the task force developed a comprehensive reform package that included mandatory bias training, independent oversight committees, and incentives for departments that demonstrated measurable progress in community relations. Nathaniel insisted that the reforms be rooted in collaboration rather than confrontation, emphasizing the need to rebuild trust. A personal reckoning. As Nathaniel worked tirelessly on the national stage, he remained deeply connected to his roots. He continued mentoring Darius, whose confidence and determination had grown exponentially since joining the Bridging the Gap program. One afternoon, during a mentorship session, Darius asked a question that caught Nathaniel off guard. "Judge Carter, do you ever get tired of fighting?" Nathaniel paused, setting down the legal brief he'd been reviewing. "Tired? Yes," he admitted, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "But giving up has never been an option. Every step forward, no matter how small, is worth it." Darius nodded, his young face thoughtful. "I want to fight too," he said, "not just for myself, but for people who don't have someone like you to stand up for them." Nathaniel smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "Then you're already on the right path." Despite the progress Nathaniel was making, he couldn't ignore the lingering tension with Officer Emily Harper. Though she had publicly apologized and taken steps to address her biases, their relationship remained strained. It wasn't until Harper requested a private meeting with Nathaniel that they truly confronted the weight of their shared history. They met at a quiet cafe, far from the public eye. Harper appeared nervous, clutching a folder as she sat across from Nathaniel. "I wanted to show you something," she began, sliding the folder across the table. Inside were letters from people Harper had met through her community outreach work, testimonials from individuals she had helped, and even from colleagues who had noticed a change in her approach. "I'm not showing you this to ask for forgiveness," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I just want you to know that your words that night, they stayed with me. They changed me." Nathaniel studied the letters, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "Change isn't easy," he said, "but it's necessary. And it's ongoing." Harper nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Redemption was a journey, not a destination. The catalyst for change. The reforms spearheaded by the task force began to take effect, with cities across the country adopting the new measures. Nathaniel's courtroom became a model for restorative justice, where cases were approached with a focus on healing rather than punishment. The community of Woodridge Heights flourished under the new era of accountability and trust. One evening, Nathaniel stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a packed auditorium. The audience included lawmakers, activists, and citizens inspired by his journey. "This isn't just about laws or policies," he said. "It's about shifting the way we see one another. Justice isn't blind. It sees the people standing before it, and it's our duty to ensure that what it sees is met with fairness, compassion, and dignity." The crowd erupted in applause, a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Nathaniel felt a surge of hope, not for himself, but for the legacy being built, one that would endure far beyond his lifetime. A legacy cemented. Years later, Nathaniel Carter's name became synonymous with justice and equity. The reforms he championed reshaped not only his city, but also communities across the nation. Darius, now a young attorney, stood in the very courtroom where Nathaniel had once presided, delivering arguments with the same passion and poise he had learned from his mentor. Nathaniel, now retired, watched from the gallery, his heart swelling with pride. The fight hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. The scars of that night in Woodridge Heights remained, but they had become symbols of resilience and growth. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp evening air filled his lungs. Nathaniel looked up at the sky, the stars shining brightly above. He had faced prejudice, fear, and injustice, but he had turned them into something greater, a movement, a legacy, a brighter future for all. And in that moment, he felt peace. The ripple effect. Years had passed since the pivotal night in Woodridge Heights, but its impact continued to ripple through the lives of countless people. Judge Nathaniel Carter's fight for justice had evolved into a legacy, one that inspired both individuals and institutions to re-examine their roles in shaping a fairer society. However, as with any change, the path forward was not without resistance. Despite the widespread praise for the reforms Nathaniel helped implement, some communities and leaders clung to the status quo. Pushback came from those who viewed the changes as a threat to tradition or a challenge to authority. Nathaniel, though no longer a sitting judge, found himself once again thrust into the heart of the battle for justice, not in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of people. A call to action. One morning, Nathaniel received a call from Senator Evelyn Monroe, who had become a close ally over the years. Her voice carried an urgency that immediately captured his attention. "Nathaniel, I need your help," she said. "Several states are pushing back against the reforms we passed. They're framing it as a threat to law enforcement, rather than a tool for accountability." Nathaniel frowned, his mind already racing. "What's the plan?" "We're organizing a series of town halls across the country to engage directly with communities. You're the person who can bridge the gap, Nathaniel. People trust you." Nathaniel knew the challenges this would bring. He had faced resistance before, anger, fear, and denial. But he also knew that avoiding uncomfortable conversations wouldn't solve anything. He agreed without hesitation. The town hall tour. The first town hall was held in a small, predominantly rural town where skepticism of government intervention ran high. The auditorium was filled with an eclectic mix of attendees, local officials, community activists, law enforcement officers, and everyday citizens. Some faces were open and curious, others were hardened with distrust. Nathaniel stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding but approachable. He began not with policy or data, but with a story. "When I was 9 years old," he said, his voice steady, "I watched my father stopped by the police for walking home late at night. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the way they treated him, like he was less than human, stayed with me. That moment shaped who I am today." The room was silent, the weight of his words palpable. Nathaniel continued, weaving his personal experiences with broader themes of justice and equality. "This isn't about pitting one group against another," he said, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "It's about building a system where everyone, citizen and officer alike, can trust in the fairness of the law." A man in the back stood up, his face lined with years of hard work and worry. "How can you expect us to trust these reforms when they make our officers feel like they're under attack?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Nathaniel nodded, acknowledging the concern. "That's a fair question. Accountability isn't about attacking anyone. It's about ensuring that the badge represents integrity and honor. When the system works for everyone, trust grows, and trust makes communities safer, for officers and citizens alike." The man sat down, his expression contemplative. By the end of the evening, Nathaniel had managed to turn tension into dialogue. People who had entered the room wary or combative left with a renewed sense of hope. A new generation of leaders. One of the most profound outcomes of Nathaniel's efforts was the emergence of young leaders inspired by his example. Among them was Darius, the once aspiring teenager Nathaniel had mentored. Now a young attorney, Darius had taken on cases that others deemed unwinnable, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. In a historic case involving wrongful eviction practices targeting minority communities, Darius stood in court, his voice unwavering as he argued for justice. Nathaniel sat in the gallery, pride and humility washing over him as he watched his protege carry the torch forward. After the trial, Darius approached Nathaniel, his face alight with determination. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. Nathaniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did this because you believed in something bigger than yourself. That's all I ever wanted, for you to see your own power." The unlikely partnership. Back in Woodridge Heights, Nathaniel continued his work with community programs. One afternoon, he was surprised to see Emily Harper, the former officer who had once wrongfully detained him, arrive at a neighborhood event. She was no longer in uniform but wore a simple shirt and jeans, blending in with the crowd. "Judge Carter," she said, her voice hesitant but sincere. "I've been volunteering at the youth center. I wanted to see how I could help here too." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then smiled. "Emily, you're always welcome here. Change starts with showing up." Over time, the two formed an unlikely partnership. Harper became a vocal advocate for police-community relations, often sharing her own story of redemption as a cautionary tale. Together, they led workshops for officers, helping them confront their biases and build better relationships with the people they served. A legacy forged in unity. As the years passed, the reforms Nathaniel championed became a model for other cities and states. The programs he initiated, like Bridging the Gap and the Justice and Equity Summit, were replicated nationwide, creating networks of communities committed to fairness and understanding. Nathaniel, now in his 70s, was honored at a national gala celebrating his lifetime of service. As he stood on stage, the applause of thousands ringing in his ears, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. "This work isn't about one person," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet strength it always had. "It's about all of us. It's about seeing the humanity in each other, even when it's hard. It's about holding ourselves accountable and lifting each other up. That's the legacy I hope we leave behind." An enduring vision. In the end, Nathaniel's story wasn't just about one man's fight against injustice. It was about the power of resilience, empathy, and collective action to create a better world. The night in Woodridge Heights had been a turning point, but it was the choices made afterward, the commitment to growth, dialogue, and unity, that truly changed lives. And as Nathaniel watched a new generation rise, their voices strong and their vision clear, he knew the fight for justice would endure. The legacy was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone. A world transformed. Decades after the incident that reshaped his life, Nathaniel Carter had become a global symbol of justice, equity, and transformation. What began as a single encounter on a quiet suburban street had evolved into a movement that redefined how communities, governments, and institutions approached fairness and accountability. Though his hair had grayed and his stride had slowed, Nathaniel's influence was stronger than ever. His story had sparked an unprecedented shift in public consciousness, yet he remained humble, steadfastly working to ensure the changes he fought for endured beyond his lifetime. Global recognition. Nathaniel's efforts eventually garnered international attention. Invitations from organizations and governments worldwide began flooding in, asking him to share his insights and strategies for combating systemic inequality. One such invitation came from the United Nations, where he was asked to address a global summit on human rights and justice. Standing before a gathering of diplomats, activists, and world leaders in Geneva, Nathaniel spoke not as a former judge or a public figure, but as a man who had experienced injustice firsthand. Justice, he began, his voice resonant in the vast hall, is not confined to courtrooms or constitutions. It is written in the hearts of people who refuse to accept the unacceptable. It transcends borders, languages, and ideologies because it is the foundation of our shared humanity. He recounted stories from his career, highlighting the power of accountability, empathy, and perseverance. He emphasized the need for global cooperation in addressing issues like racial discrimination, economic inequality, and abuses of power. True progress is not measured by the laws we pass, but by the lives we change, he concluded. Let us not merely seek justice for our own communities, but for every community everywhere. The room erupted in applause, the attendees rising to their feet. Among them were leaders who had long resisted reform, but now felt compelled to reconsider their positions. A new chapter. The Carter Institute for Justice. Recognizing the importance of sustaining his work, Nathaniel established the Carter Institute for Justice, an organization dedicated to fostering equity and accountability on a global scale. The institute focused on three key pillars: education, policy advocacy, and restorative justice programs. Education. The institute launched scholarships and mentorship programs for underrepresented youth, ensuring that the next generation of leaders was equipped to carry the torch of justice. These programs reached underserved communities around the world, from inner-city neighborhoods in the U.S. to rural villages in Africa and Asia. Policy advocacy. The institute worked with governments to craft legislation that addressed systemic inequities. By partnering with lawmakers, activists, and researchers, the Carter Institute became a driving force for policy changes that prioritized fairness and transparency. Restorative justice programs. Inspired by Nathaniel's courtroom practices, the Institute created frameworks for resolving conflicts through dialogue and understanding. These programs were adopted by schools, workplaces, and even prisons, transforming how societies addressed harm and reconciliation. The faces of change. One of the most profound aspects of Nathaniel's work was the countless lives he touched. Among them was Darius, the once aspiring teenager Nathaniel had mentored, who had risen to prominence as a civil rights attorney and advocate. Now in his 40s, Darius had become a leading figure at the Carter Institute, using his platform to champion causes that aligned with Nathaniel's vision. Judge Carter taught me that justice isn't about power, it's about responsibility, Darius often said during his speeches. He showed me that every voice matters, no matter how small it might seem. Another surprising figure was Emily Harper, the former police officer whose actions had inadvertently set Nathaniel's journey into motion. Over the years, Emily had transformed her life, becoming a leading trainer in law enforcement reform. Her candid account of the mistakes she once made served as a powerful reminder that change was possible, even for those who had faltered. Standing side by side at an event years later, Emily and Nathaniel addressed a crowd of new officers. Emily spoke first, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I am living proof that acknowledging your biases and mistakes is the first step toward becoming the person you're meant to be." Judge Carter didn't just call me out. He called me up, and I'm grateful every day for that. Nathaniel followed, his gaze sweeping over the young officers. "You are entrusted with the power to protect and serve, but with that power comes immense responsibility. Remember, justice is not just what you do, it's how you do it." The audience erupted in applause, inspired by the unlikely partnership between the two. A defining moment. One evening, Nathaniel received a letter from a young woman named Amara, who lived in a war-torn region where corruption and prejudice were rampant. Her words were raw and heartfelt. Judge Carter, I've read about your journey, and it gives me hope. Here, justice feels like a distant dream, but your story reminds me that change is possible. I want to make a difference, but I don't know where to start. Please, tell me how to begin. Nathaniel read the letter several times, his heart heavy with the weight of her plea. He decided to reply personally, crafting a letter that would become one of his most famous writings. Dear Amara, change begins with a single act of courage. It begins when you choose to stand for what is right, even when it's hard. Start where you are, with the people around you, the injustices you see, and the strengths you already have. Remember, you are not alone. Every ripple you create joins a larger wave. Keep going. The world needs your voice. The letter became a beacon for aspiring changemakers worldwide, inspiring countless individuals to take up the mantle of justice in their own communities. A legacy eternal. Nathaniel Carter passed away peacefully at the age of 87, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues. His funeral was a global event, attended by world leaders, activists, and everyday people whose lives he had touched. Darius delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking with emotion. Nathaniel Carter wasn't just a man of justice, he was a man of humanity. He taught us that even in the face of prejudice and pain, we can rise above. His legacy is a challenge to all of us, to live with integrity, to fight for what is right, and to never stop believing in the power of change. As the service ended, attendees lit candles and placed them along the steps of the courthouse where Nathaniel had presided for so many years. The soft glow of the flames symbolized the light he had brought into the world, a light that would never be extinguished. The seeds of tomorrow. Years later, a statue of Nathaniel Carter was unveiled in the heart of Woodridge Heights. The plaque beneath it read, "Justice is not the absence of prejudice, but the presence of courage to confront it." Judge Nathaniel Carter. Children played around the statue, their laughter echoing through the square. Nearby, Amara, now a young leader in her country, stood with Darius and Emily, reflecting on the man who had inspired them all. "He taught us how to fight," Amara said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "And how to forgive," Emily added. "And how to hope," Darius concluded. As the sun set, the three stood together, united by the legacy of a man who had turned injustice into a movement and left the world better than he had found it. A world reimagined. As the years passed, Nathaniel Carter's legacy became more than a memory. It became a foundation. His journey from a quiet street in Woodridge Heights to the halls of global institutions was a testament to the power of resilience, courage, and integrity. His story wasn't just about overcoming prejudice, it was about transforming it into a force for good. Communities he had never visited carried his message forward. Schools named after him taught future generations about justice and empathy, and institutions he helped shape ensured that fairness was no longer an aspiration but a reality. Yet, the most enduring aspect of Nathaniel's life was the lesson he left behind, a truth that resonated across cultures, borders, and generations. The lesson. In a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, Nathaniel's life was a beacon of what could be achieved when we choose compassion over contempt, dialogue over division, and action over apathy. He proved that justice begins with the individual. True justice starts with each person examining their own biases and actions. As Nathaniel once said, "The hardest battle isn't against others, it's against the prejudice within ourselves." Change is built together. Systems don't change through the efforts of one person alone. Nathaniel's story reminded us that lasting progress comes from communities working together, bridging divides, and lifting each other up. Mistakes can lead to redemption. Through Emily Harper's transformation, the world saw that acknowledging faults and striving to do better is not a sign of weakness but of strength. Her story was a reminder that redemption is possible for those willing to learn and grow. Hope is a powerful weapon. Nathaniel's unwavering belief in the possibility of change inspired people to confront even the most entrenched injustices. He showed that hope is not naive. It is the spark that ignites revolutions. The world he left behind. Years after Nathaniel's passing, his vision was alive in every courthouse, classroom, and community center inspired by his work. His name had become synonymous with fairness and courage, not because of grand gestures, but because of the small, meaningful steps he had taken every day to make the world a better place. At the base of his statue in Woodridge Heights, children often gathered, drawn not just by the figure, but by the stories their parents and teachers shared about him. A plaque nearby bore his most enduring words. Justice isn't just a destination. It's a journey we walk every day. The steps may be small, the path uncertain, but with each act of kindness, fairness, and courage, we create a world worth believing in. The closing scene. One quiet evening, long after the crowds had left, a young boy stood alone in front of the statue, clutching the small notebook. His mother had told him about Nathaniel Carter, about the night that changed everything and the life that followed. Inspired, he scribbled something into his notebook before placing it gently at the foot of the monument. When a passerby later picked it up, they found a single sentence written in bold, youthful handwriting. "I want to be like you, Judge Carter, someone who changes the world." And so, the story continued, not with an ending, but with a beginning. Nathaniel's life had sparked a flame that would burn bright in the hearts of all who dared to believe in justice, in each other, and in the boundless potential of humanity. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.